When we first began in planning this VE Day, it was well before anyone had conceived of a global pandemic. There were many ideas floating around about what could be done, including dressing up in World War II costume and the like. However, talking to some of the veterans around, it quickly became clear that despite the obvious sense of celebration and partying and just immense relief that happened 75 years ago today, the clear message should be about commemoration and not celebration. I don't think I've come across anyone who was involved in the Second World War who wants to remember it in a jingoistic or bombastic way. A whole generation was massively affected by it. It's something which I've come to be aware of through 22 years of ministry, especially funeral ministry, because it's abundantly clear that the depths of the war, the depths of the effects of the war has had on those people who lived through it, whether they were on active service or whether they grew up through the Blitz. The war had profound effect on a whole generation. With the current crisis we're facing, there's a lot of talk which invokes a wartime rhetoric. Personally, I think this is a serious misunderstanding of the true horror of a world war. And this remembering and commemorating today brings to mind to me three people. First, there was the chorister in a previous parish. He went by the glorious name of Nobby Clark, and Nobby always used to joke that he'd never missed a single choir practice apart from when that Mr. Hitler got in the way. It's that typical understatement, isn't it? Those years of war he writes off as, oh, Mr. Hitler got in the way of my choir practice. The only thing is, the cross in that church, the one which hung above the pulpit, was a cross which Nobby had recovered from the mud and the blood just outside of Monte Cassino, one of the very bloody conflicts in the Second World War. That cross spoke of Christ being there, being trampled down into that mud, Christ's suffering. It speaks of a pain which couldn't be joked away. And of course, it was a visual reminder for all those who fought and died. The second person, I'm sad to say, I can't actually remember his name, but maybe that's fitting because there will be so many people whose names get lost in all of this. He was someone who had been a surveyor and was called up into the war to help requisition buildings. Because of this, he was also then drawn into the Nuremberg trials. At the end of his life, he was in hospital, and the nurses were very worried about him because he was suffering terrible nightmares. The nightmares that he was having all related to the fear that he was going to be judged because he had been involved in the trials and the subsequent hanging of those who had committed terrible atrocities. The nightmares were also because of his experiencing the stories of those atrocities. He, of course, was only on the periphery of this great horror. How much worse for the actual victims of the Holocaust. And that word brings to mind an evil which is so great that it hardly bears conceiving. And yet it was an evil which was done by people just like us. And thirdly, there's Major Bonser. Now, the Major was a lovely old member of St. John the Baptist Albury congregation. David was a recipient of the Military Cross for gallantry in leading his men and for his service in North Africa and Italy. So without doubt a brave man, but also a very peaceable man. When asked what his views were about the atomic bombs, David reluctantly said that he was glad that they'd been dropped. He didn't like the idea of what had happened, but he had to say that he couldn't face the idea that if they hadn't been dropped, he and his men would have ended up on a troop ship to the Far East. The ethics of war are not nice. The reality of these ethics is that millions of civilians were killed. We had carpet bombings of cities and the introduction of nuclear weapons, which saw the obliteration of whole cities. Therefore, when we commemorate, we recognise what the true cost of peace was. And we're also asked to never take peace for granted. We give huge thanks today for the sacrifices which were made by so many people. And it's with sadness that we remember the sinfulness of humanity, the pride and desire to dominate others, which led to conflict and which still leads to conflicts. We give thanks for the many soldiers, sailors and airmen who gave their lives restraining evil and opposing tyranny, and who had to make these ethical choices. But above all, we give thanks now for the years of peace that the nations of Europe have enjoyed since the Second World War. We ask that we may never take peace for granted, and that we may all learn to be peacemakers and peacekeepers.